Vamos a dar inicio al panel 1, en donde tres grandes personajes que están aquí a mi lado y que me toca el honor de ser el moderador de este panel, nos van a presentar tres presentaciones desde un punto de vista muy personal, muy interesantes. Entonces, les doy primero el título de cada uno de los temas que van a dar los expositores. Valentín Solís de la UNAM va a dar la distribución del ingreso de las exportaciones de la economía mexicana. El doctor Arturo Pérez Mendoza, modelos de equilibrio general y salvaguardas, el caso de la industria del triple. Y Carlos López Morales nos va a presentar un modelo de comercio mundial basado en la economía insumo-producto, aplicaciones para México. Entonces, vamos a iniciar con una breve reseña de los exponentes por el mismo orden en el que llevan, en el que acabo de mencionar las presentaciones. Entonces, primero vamos a presentar al doctor Valentín Solís. Él nació en 1900.
Good afternoon. Let us begin with the first panel, where we will have three important figures, and I'm honored to moderate this panel. But anyway, they will be presenting three different personal perspectives, a very interesting one. And so, first start by letting you know Valentín Solís will speak about the distribution of income of Mexican exports, Arturo Pérez Mendoza, general equilibrium models, and safeguards the case of the AAA industry, and Carlos López Morales will present a world trade model that is based on input product economics and the applications of this model for Mexico. We will begin with a very brief presentation of their resumes, following the same order. So I'll start first, Dr. Valentín Solís. He was born in 1949, he's Mexican. He graduated at the Economics faculty of UNAM, and he has postgraduate studies in Brunel, in the United Kingdom. He has been working with multi-sectorial models for 35 years of a wide coverage for optimization, linear and non-linear programming, the static and dynamic models through different matrices of social nature, input product matrices, and multiple level matrices to create model interfaces of a mesoeconomic and microeconomic level. He has contributed to the application of the network theory to analyze linear models and develop techniques for visualizing those models, and he has also contributed to the use of tools of topology in high coverage models at the regional level. He's also helped in the global value chains concept. His most recent papers have been published by UNAM, ECLAC, the Hispano-American Society of Input Product and Studies, and the International Association of the same name. He is also coordinating the Seminar of Structural Studies at UNAM. So without no further ado, I give you Dr. Valentín. The second presenter is Dr. Carlos Arturo López Mendoza. He studied at this university. He has master's degree on Colegio de Mexico and a PhD at the Minnesota University. As of 1989, he's been working full-time at the Tecnológico Monterrey, Mexico City campus. He investigates general equilibrium models. He has taught different classes at the Tech and the Minnesota University and Colegio de Mexico. He's elaborated general equilibrium models to analyze fiscal, international trade problems, as well as climate change, and also studies on the pension reform system in Mexico. He has taught about general equilibrium models in Colegio de Mexico, Tecnológico Monterrey, ECLAC, the National Institute of Ecology and Climate Change, and some other universities. At Tecnológico Monterrey, he has been the director of the Business Master's Degree Program in 2001, 2009, and he also directed the economy faculty in 2001 and the finance faculty as of 2009. So I also ask you for a round of applause for Dr. Pérez. Our final presenter of this round is Dr. Carlos López Morales. Are you a doctor already? He is a doctor on economics, ecological doctor. And he studied at CIDE, Master's in Economics, at UNAM Economics, and he's currently directing the Faculty of Economics on the program of macroeconomics, microeconomics, micro and macroeconomics, economic environmental valuations programs at UNAM, and he's also been working in the publishing of different scientific papers, and he's been a researcher of environmental and ecological matters. So I also ask you for a hand. So why don't we start with Dr. Valentín Solís. Could you please? Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this event, the INEGI, UNAM, for the kind invitation, and I would like to thank you all for your patience and the time that you devoted to being here. I hope I'm not too hostile, but on page 2 you will see that there's a horrible amount of formulas. I apologize for that. On page 3 of my slide, a horrible amount of numbers. But to be a little bit kinder than that, because if not, I mean, many people might be saying, isn't he supposed to be an equilibrium model presenter? Why does he bring so many of those things? Well, first of all, let me explain what this is about. Could you go on to the next slide? And could somebody hand me the control? I don't know how to handle this because my wife is the one who has the rights over the remote control at home. But let me start by sharing a personal anecdote, something that happened today. And I was telling my friends about this when we were driving here. I work with a model that breaks down a matrix, and I'll explain how this is done. And we have to evaluate the impact of the external sector, the exporting sector, on how the income that is coming from exports leaking into our own economy. There has been a series of talks and that say that Mexico is almost a maquila country. What does that mean? That we receive products that have an added value from other countries, Mexico adds the assembly power, and then Mexico exports this away. And so in terms of added value, the new trend on international trade analysis has told us that we are in a deficit situation. It doesn't matter because it doesn't make sense to say that we are exporting cars when 90% of those cars have been pre-assembled in Mexico. The only thing we do is put them together. A few months ago, I visited a motorcycle factory. It was Chinese, and the bikes were coming from China in boxes, and Mexicans would only have to put on the pieces together using different tools. And so in here you could build a motorcycle in only 30 minutes, but everything has been pre-assembled. The added value doesn't include the training on metallic knowledge or how metals have to be assembled or plastic materials, nothing at all. So it's been said in Mexico, we are not duly internalizing the advantages of foreign trade, and this was the promise of NAFTA, that we would be creating many jobs because we would be great exporters, and therefore lots of income will be pouring in for Mexicans. And regardless of what the model says, the truth is that after more than 20 years of free trade agreement, we see that the promise was never fulfilled. We'll try to assess this, and the orthodox new way in which I've been working on this with Rodolfo was to work on a model that was multi-regional. And in this model, we would see the contributions of the added value for the Mexican economy in terms of the products that were exported and the things that were imported, not in terms of goods, but of added value here into Mexico to create a platform of exports. The accounting at the end of the day does matter. match because the national added value plus international added value adds up to the value of our exports. And the evidence that we found was a bit suspicious. We had two big branches with very little connection, however, they are the ones that are producing the greatest amount of exports. But not all of them, not everyone is as lucky as to have those embedded matrices in a multi-regional one. Mexico does have one. It is in the Wyatt matrix, a multi-regional matrix already exists. Mexico is also embedded or inserted at the OECD level, or the recently created for the South Cone, etc. So Mexico, it's always finding a way into those matrices, but there are other economies who are not as lucky. So the question is, could they know? Could they assess the impact of their imports and how this is filtered into the economies just by analyzing a domestic and national matrix? Truth be told, people would say, no, you need to have a multi-regional level to be able to know that. But it turns out that I was exploring this in a work that we were not that lost, but I found a piece of work from 1999, the Open Manresa work, and it was very striking. Two researchers from Barcelona, I read it, and they broke down in a social accountability matrix in a very interesting way by just dividing it into three big accounts. Social matrix is, at the end of the day, an account matrix. The national account system, the accounts between the institutional sectors, and the accounts that are matched with foreign ones. Those are called the open cycles transference or wires, and the other one was a closed one. There are many names to call it, but one is focusing on the interior, the accounts of the productive sector, looking at them from within, and then how institutional actors are behaving in this, and then with the rest of the world. By breaking those accounts down, they come up with a very interesting proposal, and that is, they say, it's been broken down. Why don't we separate further the external sector? First, we could consider this as endogenous. What does it mean? It is a part of our own economy. I mean, imports and exports are considered as a part of us. Once this has been done, this matrix is dividing into those three chunks, and then we get rid of the external sector part. Since the coefficients with the interactions coming from the closing matrix are already loaded, we can visualize whether the external sector is truly contributing to the creation or the addition of value, or paying the domestic factors, and how the economic sectors are affected by this. So it is a very simple model, but a very creative one. And as good models, it shouldn't be played with hundreds of equations. 2 or 3 equations are more than enough. You have the matrix, you break it down, and you look at the results. And it's pretty common sense. So Valentín was there. And I have certain delirium. As an economist, I have a fascination of doing things without my what I call the spaghetti programming system. I introduce one thing, then another one, then another, and then I take something out and bring it back in, and that's how I do it. And the spaghetti system is working for me, even though programmers laugh at me, and they sometimes feel offended by the things I do. Look at the redundancies this guy's creating, but the truth is that this is the way in which I get rid of programmers, and it's a blessing. So, gentlemen, you cannot go around the world of economics with a programmer on your side. You need to do your own programming. And you need to get your feet wet, as people in Spain said, in everything programming related. But now, luckily, programming is becoming friendlier. So that's what I did. I chose a program, and it now seems familiar to me. And once when you start seeing a software that's friendly to use, your head has been messed up with. But anyway, it made sense. I did what I told you, and at 10 p.m. at night, there was a power outage, and my program was lost. The data, the modeling I did, and Valentín didn't have an outbreak system. So lesson number 1, you need to back up your information safely. So I was so desperate, feeling frustrated, and I was, what am I going to do? Tomorrow I have to present this, I need to tell them what I found, and nothing. So I said, hey honey, I need a very strong coffee right now. So she brought me a big jug of coffee, and I started to get to it. And I was born in 1949. Thank you for that, dear press presenter, but I'm 67 years old. I won't be able to sleep all night, and I'm going to go to bed at 11 because I won't be able to pull an all-nighter. Let's be reasonable about that. But I will be dreaming about the solution, I thought. And yeah, I got everything ready. I had the program running, an emergency program that I have. Fortunately, it was not made by me, but by somebody who's very good at it. And he employed me for almost 2 years at ECLAC because this program was designed by a Colombian friend that's called Parra. But anyway, I digress. Juan Carlos. Yeah, very skilled person. He created a software for accounting matrixing of a social type. And so I uploaded many routines. He presented this program in Seville in 2008. And he's worked with this program for 15 years. But as any skilled worker, he gets in my way as well. People who are truly skilled, it comes a moment when you say, back off. You are acting fiercely. There are departments who are studying poverty, and they have 20, 30 people in the World Bank staff. And here comes this guy with the friend, and they were as efficient as a whole institution. So you thought, they're making me look bad, let's get rid of this guy, regardless of what you do. And this is making me think of a novel by Vargas Llosa, Pantaleón y las Visitadoras. So his problem was that he was too talented. But anyway, he was sent to some other philosophical area, and he was left alone, and the compulsive models were also lost. But it turns out that I used this program, and it has saved me. And I saw that he's doing the opposite thing. Instead of creating an endogenous external sector, breaking it down, and then get rid of the N3, as people call it for the Stone method, N1, N2, and 3, what he does is that he concentrates on doing it the other way around. Everything is endogenized with the exception of the external sector, the foreign sector. Everything is endogenized. So you fix the original matrix so that they are blocks of accounts. So when they are broken down, they become significant. Because everything that happens because of the external effects of a matrix where everything's endogenous except the foreign sector is caused by everything but the foreign sector. So you could look at this from a methodology that is doing quite the opposite. And by the way, as a pseudo-academician that I am, I must acknowledge that it was done by Tarp, an economist, in Vietnam. So that you know. So everything endogenized exception of the foreign sector, the breakdown is done, and here we look at it from the other perspective. We see how the accounts that are feeding back the external factor are fed forward to the other accounts. It is the same model of the Open Manresa, but look from the opposite side of the mirror, and the results are quite amazing. So I went to bed at 11 as I had promised, and I set my alarm at 5:15 a.m. So I slept for 6 hours. I woke up, and everything was solved. By 9 a.m., I had the final result. Why? Because I'm sure I dreamt about this matter. I don't remember it clearly, but I will present this. We will see two things about this breakdown. First of all, how to do the breakdown, the algebraic part of it, but this is a problem of elegance. I could explain the breakdown as it is, and then I could see how the exports are also requiring imports. People call this the vertical specialization. Just to make it exciting, Rasmussen said this way beyond what you know. Look at chapter 8 of chaining, the chaining book. Everything was explained there, but anyway. How much do I need of exports to be able to import? For each export unit, how many import units do I require? That is a simple question that requires some analysis, because in an indirect way, it is letting us know the added value that's being incorporated to the exports. And the other thing is, who are the beneficiaries of those exports? If you have heard about the Mexican elite, Mr. Slim, and the gang, well, let's see if the model will point out to the fact that those guys or a certain group is benefiting more than the rest. So we have import needs to export on the one hand, and the export about the exports who's gaining. And through a simple decomposition, let's go to the next slide. And this is the threat that I have applied against you. I cannot read this because I don't have my glasses. I hope I'm not rude. I'm turning around. Is there a pointer here? This is a social content matrix. The column and the row are the external accounts, the foreign accounts, and the rest are endogenous. It's been normalized, etc. It's not expressed in flows, it's normalized. And from here, we will further divide it. A plus equals B plus C. B is the diagonals, and C is everything outside of the diagonal. Is it complicated? It's piece of cake. So here we have. If we follow the identities, the basic identity of the product, you'll see that we get to this formula. I'll go to the formula directly if you want to follow it, and if not, look at Stone's description in 1985, Social Accountant Matrices, and by the way, it was published by the World Bank, and if you go to their website, it's for free. You can download the PDF. That's one of the best tools you can have. Anyway. This breakdown is quite simple. It was not proposed by Stone originally, though. It was by it. But he did a multiplying breakdown. 3 matrices were created, M3, 2, and 1, that stem from the identities that are up here. And this is how you get 1, 2, 3 matrices. And with that, this is the identity that's finally created. M is called, all of that is M times X, and this appears in everyone, but since it was too long, we simplified it. D equals Y minus B times C. Look at the amount of numbers, it's a nightmare. But anyway, this D is I minus B times C, and this D appears systematically all throughout, and this is how we come up with the multiplying breakdown where you can separate the effects of each one. Stone, and by the way, Stone is a British guy, very orthodox, very elegant, right? So he breaks it down in a very transparent way. It's additive, it's transparent. He proposed the following. Once you do have the multiplying, M1 equals M1, N2 equals M2 minus I times M, and the third matrix is the 3 impacts. Those are the chunks of each one of those matrices. Those are the formulas that come from here. Input and product in the diagonal. And over here, it refers to the ones that are outside of the diagonal. And this is the most complicated one. It's horrible. It's the one you see here. Those are the regression effects. The direct effects, the effects between the accounts and the regression, the feeding back effects. This is a true circus to break down, but you can do it. I've been threatened. Anyway. We have the breakdown. Let's go on to the next slide, and this is how it is applied. It's horrendous, but we will see that we have the 12 multipliers broken down in transference effects, open effects, closing effects. This is M1, M2, and M3. If you break down those matrices, you can obtain in this separation how each one of the sectors are participating in creating imports for exports. Sector 21 is leading the way, computer manufacturing. That is to say, we don't only work with internal circuitry, we only assemble the computers. The creation of, what is it, 22? What is this? Electricity production, much of the equipment that we use, it comes from abroad. Third, transportation equipment fabrication, many imports are required to be able to export a car. Other manufacturing industries, and that's it. It is pretty common sense. It seems to be true, at least from a Russian perspective. Exporting companies that are leading the way require lots of imports, are heavily dependent on imports. So that is why when we say they are not that connected, it makes sense. Who is winning? Who are the winners of the story? How much time do you have left? 1 minute, all right. Here we have the multiplying effects, and this is where we see the breakdown to check who the winners are. You find them here. We have the deciles according to income levels and the transfers effects. The ones who win the most are the ones that are over here. The usual ones, the big ones. Look at them. Especially considering things are coming from abroad. This is earning 52 cents for each dollar it's exported, and this one is earning 4 cents, less than 4 cents. It's 4 cents. So it is as asymmetric as income distribution is. What does that mean? It means that you are fostering economics through exporting, but because of the geometry for economy, at the end of the day, those earnings, even though indirectly, they go to the pockets of the rich. This is not something that should be shocking. The important thing is that here we see the types of exports and the sectors that are contributing to the increase of Mr. Slim's wealth. There's a type of analysis that we can do with this. It doesn't solve the problem, but at least we have a clearer picture of the type of economy we are living in. And the sectors that we should promote so that the distribution of those benefits by external imports could be better internalized for workers, and this could be classified. It requires patience and time and having a non-break system. And lots of coffee, of course, and a small group of people to help you, but the method of Stone's breakdown, Piatt's method, does work well. And it is an alternative of having a multi-regional matrix. And those, you have the open Manresa that works, who are a mirror of one another, and those methodologies I highly recommend you use them because they do give very sensitive answers for those of us who understand the economy. I believe that the applications, like in the case of Vietnam and some others, the Spanish case, were also reproduced later by another university in Spain, and a Mexican magazine also did that. This breakdown method was analyzed. The San Juan case. Who else? Patricia. Your time's up. All right. Well, anyway, this is the toy that I have for you to play. You get the program and the data for free, and the explanation. If you care for it, we could be in touch later. And for that, we'll have to have a conversation at 2 a.m. But of course, this is just a small demonstration of how to use a social accountability matrix and a decomposition model to identify specific problems. Thank you.
Okay, next we will have Dr. Arturo Pérez present. So go ahead, you have 20 minutes for your presentation. Thank you, good afternoon. Before getting started, I'd like to thank the INEGI and the UAM for the invitation to be in this event, and of course all of you for being here this afternoon. In this presentation, I will be talking about general equilibrium models and safeguards, and specifically I will address the case of an industry and an experience that I had analyzing a real-life problem that happened here in Mexico, which was imposing a safeguard to the import of plywood here in Mexico. So, just to give you some figures for those of you who don't know or a better understanding of this, safeguards are accepted by the World Trade Organization, and what safeguards entail is that these measures can be applied when the imports of a certain product have risen so much in comparison to the national production. When they have risen so much and are carried out in circumstances that can lead to harm to the national production branch that creates similar products. So it's something that the WTO allows. What the general trade law establishes here in Mexico is that the goal of safeguards are to prevent a serious harm and to prevent national producers to adjust. Another very important thing that is established is that the Ministry of the Economy has to monitor when a safeguard is imposed to protect an industry. They have to prevent as much as possible that safeguard has a negative impact on other productive processes and, of course, on the consumer. So it's very interesting to see how to measure impacts whenever a safeguard is imposed. The impact that it will have on producers, on the consumers, how much the productive branch that I'm trying to protect will actually be helped, and how to protect the interests in order to decide whether the safeguard should be imposed or not. So a general equilibrium model is extremely useful because it allows us to have quantitative data to measure exactly to what extent the consumer could be damaged or harmed, the other sectors, and how much the sector that is asking for a safeguard to be imposed can be benefited. Some figures about this case. In 2002, a few years ago, national plywood producers went directly to the Ministry of the Economy to ask for protection. A protectionist measure. They asked for a safeguard to be imposed because the national production was being affected significantly by foreign products. Some figures that they presented in order to justify the need for that showed that in the year 2000, many countries significantly increased their export of plywood to Mexico, such was the case of Malaysia, Chile, and the United States. They increased their imports, which you will find up on that slide, 47%, 78%, 132, and 145% respectively. That is, there was a significant increase in plywood exports from other countries. The national production fell 15%, and the national consumption improved 22%. So there's a higher demand for plywood, there's a fall in national production, and there's an increase in exports, or imports in the case of Mexico. So the national producers asked for protection against these foreign competitors, and they asked the safeguard to be imposed. Of course, the Ministry of the Economy, before approving a safeguard, has to carry out some research in order to see if that is indeed justifiable. And part of the research that they do is trying to understand how the consumer will be affected by this and how other sectors will be affected. They also have to analyze if the fall in plywood production was due to the imports or if there was another reason. Because if the national producers are not doing their job, then we have no need to protect them. Also, if they could foresee that imports would increase, then, and they didn't do anything about it, then there's nothing that we can do to protect them. So as part of the research, the plywood producers were looking for arguments in order to get the safeguard to be approved. But importers wanted to make sure that it wouldn't. So they hired a consultant agency to analyze all the implications and potential effects of the safeguard, and they asked me to look at the impact on the consumers and their well-being and on other sectors. At the time, I elaborated a general equilibrium model, and later on, I designed the model because the law establishes a 30-day period from the moment when the claim is presented and the Ministry of the Economy decides to begin an investigation. They give a 30-day period for the two parties to present the information before making a decision. So we have a very short period, and we had to design a general equilibrium model. So I will tell you the complexities of elaborating a model such as this one to analyze the impact of a very specific product, in this case plywood. So I did a standard model, and sometime afterwards I designed a more complex model, which is the one that I will be sharing with you. So I designed the model, and what I wanted to see in this simulation was to look at the impact of increasing the tariff that has to be paid for importing plywood from an average 15.64% before the safeguard to 35%, which was what the Ministry of the Economy was proposing as a safeguard for this industry. Some of the characteristics of the model, I really won't go in depth because it would take me a very long time to explain all the equations that were included in the model, but what I can tell you is that most of the model was a standard general equilibrium model, but I tried to be very careful in modeling, very much in depth, in detail, very carefully, the plywood sector here in Mexico. So usually general equilibrium models assume a perfect competition in each one of the sectors, and I wanted to model the plywood sector differently in a way to reflect reality much better. So I modeled it by incorporating growing performances and an oligopoly behavior in this market. In order to have growing performances, I assumed that there was a fixed cost, which means that every single one of the companies competing in this sector has a certain amount of fixed capital and work, regardless of how much plywood they want to produce in this sector. So this is one of the few equations that I will be presenting to you. We have these two over here that indicate that the amount of work. Number 5 has to do with the number of sector within the model. That is, sector 5 is plywood. So the total work of plywood that was necessary depends on the number of companies represented in the sector, which is the letter N, and the letter L is the work required by each one. And we have two terms, the variable work, which depends on how much they want to produce, and the second term is the fixed part, which is the fixed amount of work that each company has in the first equation, multiplied by the number of companies, and something similar happens in the second equation. So once I incorporated fixed costs, I have found a sector with scale growing performances. The second modification I made to the model was assuming that this sector behaved as an oligopoly, as a Carnot-type oligopoly with a homogeneous product, which is very reasonable because it's very difficult to distinguish between plywood produced by one company and the plywood produced by a different company. For those of you who are familiar with this type of market structure, one of its characteristics is that this condition has to be met. There's a framework on the price of the marginal cost, which is given by this equation, where we find the price multiplied by 1 minus 1 over the demand elasticity of the industry that is received by each one of the industries in this sector, times the number of companies. That's what gives us the marginal cost, and that's how we can maximize profit in this sector. What was a bit complicated was calibrating this model, because it required bringing together a lot of information which was not available at the time. We didn't have the input-output matrix, which was published by INEGI in 2013, because we didn't have an input-output matrix for a long time. So I chose one that was designed by a researcher in 1993, and I had to use the RAS system to update the matrix to the year 2000. I had to use national accounts in order to do this RAS method. And there's another complication. When you analyze safeguard problems, it's very likely that the safeguard will be imposed on a very specific product, and possibly the level of data disaggregation doesn't reach that specificity. So in this case, once I had the matrix, I could update it, but I didn't have a broken down picture of the plywood sector. I needed to generate that. And as I said before, you have to be very careful, because when you're going to give a recommendation for public policy, you have to make sure that the calculation is as accurate as possible, so that the results will contribute positively to the public policy. So I had to look for other sources of information, like the economic census, where I got information about the plywood sector, and I used information that had been generated by the Chamber of Commerce that plywood producers are a part of, where there were figures about who was buying plywood, to what extent plywood was being sold to other sectors, to what extent it went to final demand. And I had to use that information that the plywood sector was providing. I had to use information from the economic census, the input-output matrix, and I had to do that in order to generate my social accounting matrix. And once I had that, then I could calibrate the model and get my simulations going. This is, of course, a difficulty that, well, now we have more recent input-output matrices for every class, which can make it easier to analyze impact when you want to take a look at what will happen if a safeguard is imposed on a particular sector, but at the time it didn't exist. So let's look at the results that I found. I will be presenting only the impact on final consumer and the impact on other sectors. To make sure that I had reliable data, what I did was I used the model with a perfect competition for the plywood sector, and then I also used it assuming that the plywood sector was an oligopoly. Something that I had to input into the model was the number of companies operating in this sector, and according to the economic censuses, I found two figures. The first one is 118 companies, which is the figure that I got from the census. So I ran my model with 118 companies, assuming that that's the number of companies that existed in the sector. But something else that I did was take into account that 9 companies are the ones that practically control total production. So I also did another run considering only those 9 companies. It's very important to look at the elasticity of substitution between national and foreign plywood. If I impose a tariff and I make make imports more expensive, then the final consumer will have to substitute those imports with the national product. So elasticity is essential. That's why I did two elasticity calculations, one that was done some years ago by the Ministry of the Economy with a value of 1.2, and another estimate that a consultant company that I participated in carried out, which gave a figure of 1.85. So I wanted to do this and make this calculation with both of these numbers, depending on seeing how it would change based on the number of companies and the changing elasticity, to be able to have more reliable final results. And these were my findings. I also calculated compensated variation, and the number that you see here in the first column is compensated variation as a proportion of the income of the consumer. The result is negative, which is not surprising. If I make a product more expensive, then the consumer will have to buy it at a higher cost, and they want to substitute it for a national product, then the national good will also be more expensive. So the fact that this final result is negative is not surprising. The impact is not very significant. It's 0.03%. So that's because the national consumer, I mean, not many consumers buy plywood, unless, you have to do a model for your high school homework. So it's more of an indirect purchase, because you buy furniture or a shelf or a closet that uses plywood. So the impact is negative. It's relatively small. And then what I did was to see how the plywood sector would be affected. And I found that their production would increase between 8 and a little over 12% with the imposition of this safeguard. And then what I analyzed was how the two sectors that are most related to plywood would be affected. The first is the furniture industry, where there would be a fall in production of 0.64%, 0.67%. And then the construction industry, which uses a lot of plywood to manufacture closets or shelves, finishings. So you can see here that the decrease in the construction industry is also very small. It's 0.03, 0.02, depending on the version of the model that I used. And then what I did was to get some figures to see, well, what does this imply? A growth of 0.72% in the plywood sector represents what? Or the fall in the furniture industry is X, then what would be the result? I found the negative effect that is that in absolute terms, their fall on the other sectors is bigger than the increase in the plywood industry. So with that information, we can draw some conclusions, which was that the safeguard would have a negative impact on the consumer, and also a negative impact if we look at the total figure of what happens with the increase in the plywood industry and the effect on other sectors. So there's a negative increase for the consumer, 0.03%, and there's also a negative impact on other industries, such as furniture manufacturing and the construction industry, as we saw. So these were my conclusions. So the safeguard again has a negative effect on the well-being of consumers and a negative effect on the related sectors. It has negative effects as well on the economy as a whole. there would indeed be a rise in production of plywood, because obviously it's a protectionist measure in their favor, so that loss of 15% that they had in the year 2000 would be gone, because there would be a rise from 8 to 12% using this safeguard. So the conclusion that I reached was that if the Ministry of the Economy wanted to avoid harming the consumer and other related sectors, then analyzing the impacts, the safeguard would be a bad idea. The first version of the model that we did when it was being discussed through this conclusion, but in the end, the Ministry of the Economy decided to impose the safeguard anyway. Sometimes it doesn't only depend on what we saw. Obviously, what I'm showing you is only one part of the picture, one part of the analysis. There were many other actors presenting figures. It doesn't only depend on what the models show. There are other political factors that have an impact on these types of decisions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Doctor. Next, we will listen to Dr. Carlos Lopez. Go ahead, Doctor. Thank you very much. Thank you, INEGI, Dr. Lilia Rodriguez, for inviting me to participate in this workshop. It's truly an honor to be sharing the panel with two professors that I admire greatly and of whom I have learned so much in the course of my studies. And I'd like to explain why the title of my presentation doesn't really show the words Computable General Equilibrium Models or Social Accounting Matrix, considering that that is the main topic behind this event. And well, the reason is very clear, which is that I don't really work with any of those two things, but I will be presenting something that is very similar in a way. It's a sort of alternative when it comes to economic modeling. It's an alternative to general equilibrium models. So in my presentation, I want to share this alternative to computable general equilibrium models, first by giving you a presentation of what, in my opinion, are the strengths and the main features of these types of models, and then the type of modeling that I will be presenting. What are the main differences and what are their strengths and weaknesses? At the end of the day, I think that they have the same root, the same methodological root. So I really liked hearing Dr. Solís talk about Stone and Payet, because these types of models come from the same tradition, the same source of economic analysis, which we are now trying to apply, but which was born in the 1940s. Probably, and of course has become more complex as it has evolved. But one way or another, we always come back to our origins. I also really like some of the slides that Dr. Bayar shared with us, where we saw the different types of models, and the input-output model was there, almost at the top of the list. So as part of the first work that was done was with general equilibrium model, then the open model, and that's, I think, the background of my presentation. So first I will give you my personal understanding of what the strengths and weaknesses are of the computable general equilibrium models, which I think are very useful to hear after the presentation that we have just listened to. Then I will try to give you examples of applications of input-output models. So first, computable general equilibrium models. When it comes to databases, They can be used when we're doing calibration, as the process that was just showed to us with the input-output models. So this modeling strategy uses these databases to try to represent a specific economy. The solution algorithm, at least in the models that I have analyzed, because I do environmental and water models, and there are many computable general equilibrium models that are being used in that branch. So at least what I see that is applied there, that is implemented as a solution algorithm, is one of two things, which seen from up close maybe are not very different. One is maximizing a function, for instance, well-being or production, in an optimization process as is used in the economy. Or another solution algorithm is establishing a condition of equilibrium in the market, such as vacuum markets or markets in which supply equal demand. Generally speaking, both of the two strategies, I don't think that these are the only two strategies, but they are the ones that I have seen the most. And what I didn't include up there on the slide, or rather I did include it, but you can't really read it there, where it says parameter treatment, is that parameter treatment of computable general equilibrium models are usually elasticities. Production functions, for instance, you can include elasticity of substitution as a parameter that is given that may or may not change. But in the model, those elasticities are exogenous to the model. Also models that are related to international trade. Generally speaking, with trade, it could be regional trade, but also international trade. Elasticities of import and export substitutions are included. The Armelton assumption, which assumes that products are differentiated by their origin. If a consumer had a specific preference, for instance, plywood, if plywood is coming from Germany versus plywood coming from Brazil, when you do an analysis of different scenarios, then those elasticities usually remain a constant, and that has an impact on the trade flows that the model offers. I would say that those are the main characteristics of a general equilibrium model, and I don't mean that those are all the applications, but the ones that I have seen in the work that I do are comparative statics model, that is, they're defined for a specific moment in time, usually as a specific scenario is created and then there's a change in policy that is analyzed and compared. Sometimes in environmental models to study climate change, that's what we do in order to analyze, well, what will happen if there's a fall in rainfall, or there's an increase in X crops and other environmental questions that may arise. And part of the criticism that I'm interested in from a theoretical point of view and from an implementation point of view of an economic model is precisely this superficial or non-structural elements, which are basically elasticities. Elasticity is a measure of change between two variables, and the mechanism that explains that change is not necessarily explicit in the elasticity itself. So if you assume a constant elasticity, you could be assuming one way or another a specific mechanism that has an impact when you change variable X to variable Y in terms of demand elasticity between the price and the amount that is being demanded, if there's a trade need, if there's an increase in the import value, or consumption of imports is maintained. That I think is very interesting, and that can be all summed up in reduced and structural models. Structural model specifically considers within their equations the mechanisms that explain the economic process that we're interested in, whereas a reduced model doesn't necessarily consider those figures, but rather depends on parameters that could be interpreted in a more limited way. So this is a 5-minute personal summary of what I understand a computable general equilibrium model entails. And I want to share this different, not very different, but different in some ways, of a different economic model, an empiric model, which is based on a world trade model that was established by Pierre Duchin in 2005, and that from that moment has had several applications, both for specific countries. I have implemented it in Mexico from a multi-regional perspective, but there are applications for China and some others, considering the whole world as an economic entity analyzing trade flows between different regions and countries, etc. It's very similar to computable general equilibrium models, and they also use as databases the input-output charts. And even though we haven't done an empirical modeling, it's not limited, at least not in concept. It's not limited to the input-output charts. We can also include social counting matrices, and for exogenous accounts, the ones that are maintained like that, we can use a social counting matrix that can be done without a problem in this strategy. But perhaps, unlike most of the applications that I have found of computable general equilibrium models, this type of model is specifically used for production factors besides work capital, specifically natural resources. When Professor Bayar was saying that models are done for a purpose, the main purpose behind these models, at least when it comes to their design, what Duchin conceived was doing sustainability analysis, so you have to incorporate natural resources. So this model explicitly incorporates natural resources as limiting production factors in each one of the divisions where it is established. I work with water, so you include water as a production factor, but you can also include soil, or you can also see it from a different perspective, from emissions or anything else. That is slightly different perhaps to the strategies used in computable general equilibrium. Solution algorithm, instead of maximizing production or well-being, the solution algorithm is rather a generalized theory of comparative advantage. Instead of maximizing consumption and production, what they maximize is the global production expenses, because the total demand is satisfied and the economic regions use the resources that they have. No economic region can use more work than they have available, or they can't use more water or soil than they have available. So production is physically restricted. And the parameter treatment, unlike what happens in computable general equilibrium models based on the elasticities that I mentioned before, the parameters for these models are technical coefficient of the Jean-Pierre's analysis. They describe technologies and the uses of inputs to get products. They're more structural parameters. So in this discussion of superficial versus deep elements, these are much deeper than elasticities. Elasticities, as part of this modeling, are endogenous. They're not exogenous to the model. And similarly to what happens in computable general equilibrium models, and this is why I see this type of model as an alternative, is that they also help you to do comparative analysis through designing different scenarios, just as the example that we just saw. So what happens if we impose a tax on a particular good? Or what happens if we incorporate a carbon tax or water to make it more sustainable? So it's a way to analyze policies and to look at future scenarios, and this has been one of the main applications of this type of model. What happens, for instance, with world trade of food in the year 2015, when we have 3 billion people more in the world, then conditions will be different. So that type of future scenario can be modeled. What will happen with climate change? What will happen with rainfall patterns? Basically, that's it. I was saying that parameters are structural, that is, they don't change when the environment changes or when the context changes. They are technological parameters. They describe a technology and not an elasticity. Elasticities, which you could continue to calculate, are endogenous. You can have an elasticity in the basic scenario, and if there's a change in policy, there could be a different elasticity because you're dealing with the process, which connects the two variables that you are analyzing, and it can enable you to see the changes in elasticity. Units are usually hybrid. This is something that is also happening in computable general equilibrium models, but in the past it wasn't like that. They were always understood in monetary terms, and here we have monetary units, but we also have physical units. For instance, water use is measured in cubic kilometers. The use of soil is measured in hectares, or employment is measured in number of people. So those are physical units, and they coexist with monetary units. Now I would like to, and I hope I don't talk about the same thing that Dr. Solís did, but I want to share some of the equations. This happens to me very often when you're analyzing a computable general equilibrium model. I think there's a common practice in literature which is not sharing the explicit model in the paper. And if you want to look at the equations for the model, you can't find them. But I like seeing what are the assumptions. There are many things that are taken for granted, that are assumed, I think, at least in the literature that I have seen of computable general equilibrium, and sometimes the model is not very explicit. Sometimes you have to go look for the websites of the authors, and occasionally you can find a presentation from 15 years ago about the model. So in order to be transparent, I really like sharing the equations, sharing the models, in order to give you a clearer picture of what we're talking about. So, very briefly, I want to show you how the model of world trade is created based on the original model that I assume everybody is familiar with. The open Leontief model. And the first element that is added to those equations that you see up there is the very famous I minus A times X equals Y. We have to add resource restrictions. So the matrix F, which you see there, picks up the requirements of production factors, capital, work, but also maybe soil and water, per unit of product, which is multiplied by X then, has the total use of production factors, including natural resources, and that has to be less than, there's a vector of that small lowercase v that shows how much water there is in an economy, how much soil there is. That's the first issue to be considered. The second is that you can take into account the cases for which different technologies exist in order to get the same product. The easier example of this is, for instance, irrigation agriculture versus a different kind of agriculture. They can both produce an X tonnage of products with different technologies in order to get to the same product. And that, of course, happens. There are different technological options, and the product will be the sum of what is obtained by using each of the technologies, and by using the factors that each of those technologies provide has to be less than what is available in the economy. That is the main basis. It becomes multi-regional, so then we have to consider that there are M number of regions, and in each one of those M regions there are L technologies for each product, so you get an addition. That is what you see there, but the idea is also to break down, to disaggregate the national product by regional product. You see how much is produced of X thing in each region and by using what technology. So if you're talking about food production, whether it is irrigation agriculture or seasonal agriculture, which was normal to include because I was looking at water use. So this model is already predetermined. It has multiple solutions. You cannot get an inverse such as the Leontief original equation. It gives you a selection criteria to select one of those various options. And the criteria that this strategy considers is what you see at the bottom there to calculate production costs. So the F, as I said, measures utilization of factors. X is the product, and vector pi is how many times you can use production factors, and that gives you total production cost. The model, and this brings me almost to the end of my presentation, at least the presentation of my equations, it minimizes production costs, subject to production actually satisfying total demand. That's why it's a trade model, because we're only interested in satisfying the country's demand. And a region could be producing more than another region, and so the product could flow in the different regions. And the regions cannot use more production factors than are available. Because it is a linear program, all the equations are linear, you can't use derivatives. This is solved by operation, research, and linear investigation, but you can also use the theorems that are available. There's a duality theorem that for each primal model that is determined, this is a prime model that determines quantities, there's a dual model, which is a price model. So the model endogenously determines the product of each region, but also the price that satisfies the markets, that is, that solves the general equilibrium problem on the one hand, but also determines the rent of scarcity of production factors, which is the other factor that is being included here. Maybe you'll recognize it if you have the John Tucker fresh in your memory. What you see there is how they complement themselves. Is restriction is satisfied if the product satisfies demand, then the price of the good is positive. If you use all the work, all the capital, all the soil, all the water that a region has, then there are shadow prices for each one of those resources, which will also be positive. And as a conclusion, the first condition that we find there is of the duality theorem. In equilibrium, these two models, the value of the objective function of these two models are the same, but what you see on the left, P times Y, is the value of total demand, so it is the GDP. And what you see on the right-hand side is the total value of paying for the factors, so it is the macro identity of the GDP seen from a different perspective. On the one hand, we have the value of goods and services, the final value, and on the other hand, we have the sum of the added value, which is all of that breakdown that you see on the right-hand side. So in this equilibrium, we have this accounting identity that shows that this is a good model because it is based on solid theories. So as a conclusion, I didn't have a lot of time to talk about the strategy of implementation for Mexico, but if you want, during the Q&A, I can go more in depth about this, but it is an interregional trade model because it determines the level of activity for each sector in each region by choosing the technologies that can help minimize costs. So it implements a generalized perspective of comparative advantage. You might remember the theory of comparative advantage to decide what region will specialize in what product, and this model can help to determine that in a very transparent way. And they also determine the level of use of production factors in each region, including natural resources. So in the research that I have carried out in the last few years, I implemented it for Mexico, doing this analysis for the case of water. But I don't want to go on for more than that, so I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
So why don't we start with our Q&A? We have less than 20 minutes. I propose that we collect several questions and give the speakers 5 minutes to answer the questions that are asked to them. So I see some hands raising already. But while we wait for the microphone to go back, why don't we start with 3 questions, one for each one of the speakers, on my own questions. The first question is for Dr. Valentín Solís. Could you please explain a bit more about information sources that you use for this model and the main problems that you faced while working with that? A question for Dr. Arturo about the model and the simulation to estimate the impact on the final consumer. Did you consider this not only in terms of private consumption but in exports as well, because in private consumption the demand for plywood would be very small. The indirect effects would be furniture or construction, as you mentioned. And the third question is for Carlos, information sources as well. Could you please expand, elaborate on that? A question for Carlos Lopez. Could you please let us know, in the case of Mexico, could you explain the regions that you consider for the study? How was production of water behaving, or rather the water flows that could be happening between the 2 regions, and the prices that you found? Is this something that could help you come up with a recommendation for a water policy in Mexico? 2 clarifying questions. Arturo, the elasticity of substitution that you used was of around 1%. Isn't it too low? Plywood, wouldn't it be more almost a perfect substitute? Perhaps the German one is very different to the Mexican plywood. And if that is the case, if they're that different, then perhaps that could explain why imports are increasing. So I'm asking the reason for that value. And in that model, I guess you didn't model strategic behavior of an oligopoly. The way in which you modeled the oligopoly was by diminishing returns, right? And one last question on elasticities. Perhaps I got this wrong, but when you say that they're endogenous, is your model not giving you elasticities? Because I thought you were using TF technologies everywhere. Elasticities then would be estimated at 0. A very simple question for Arturo Pérez about the behavior of the oligopoly in the plywood and the perfect competition in the rest of the sectors. It seems to me that this could be biasing the results, because there are different sectors in the economy that are behaving just with that structure, with that oligopoly structure. If you assume that this is perfect competition, then, for instance, speak about construction. Construction is highly concentrated, so perhaps this is something that could be affecting the results. What do you think about that? I have 2 questions for Carlos Lopez. This is the subject that I know the least about, but the 3 presentations were very good. Congratulations. The labor market restrictions and the capital restrictions. In the case of the labor market, you would say that there's free entrance and exit. There's lots of migration, so there are no barriers for the entry. In Europe, people can work all throughout the place, so in an ex ante, that doesn't seem to be a restriction. And now about the freedom of capital movement, that's also that when you speak of restriction, I don't know what you mean by that. And the other question is, in many years, many of the countries are struggling over natural resources. If a mine is going to be constructed in a certain area, the people who live around complain that this is going to affect the environment. This has happened in Chile or Panama and many other countries. So the question is, could this type of analysis be used to assess the impact of such policies? Because on the one hand, you speak of minimizing the cost, but what cost do you mean by that? And do negative externalities are included in this, or is it a social cost instead of a private one? And so, considering your methodology, your framework, do you think you could analyze those problems using your method? Anyone else? Hi. A quick question for Dr. Carlos. What was the size of the input product matrix that you used for your work? And did you have a problem of specialization in the linear program? Were there products that had a zero production, or did you use a method of restriction to overcome that problem? Thank you for the questions. Who would like to start? Speaking about labor, we analyzed the impact, especially of the things that we wanted to discover due to the nature of our study, the impact on consumers and the impact on the related sectors. I don't have the information with me of to what extent were exports or other variables affected. During my presentation, I only focused on realizing the impact of the things we were analyzing. And about substitution elasticities, yes, they were low. For instance, 0.185 is a very low one for a good that we believe is very similar from one company from one country to the other. So we tried to find an explanation of why those elasticities that were econometrically analyzed were given such a low value. The only explanation that we found was that plywood that is imported was being used as a complement to a certain extent of the national production. That is to say, it was not displacing, it was not outcrowding national production, but rather it was adding, complementing it. So if in 2000 there was a fall of 50% in Mexico and demand had increased, what was happening with those imports is that they were covering an already existing demand, one that was not satisfied by national products. So they were complementary in nature, and this is why the elasticities were not that high. That is the explanation that we gave it at that moment. The way in which oligopolies are modeled, it is difficult to model the strategic behavior. So what we assumed was, if you remember, one of the equations that I gave you, there was a demand elasticity as perceived by the company. So an assumption is made of what the company believes will happen with the industry demand when the company decides to increase its production by 1 unit. So we use a simplifying assumption. If the company will increase by 1 unit, then this is how they consider it to be. We simplify the problem so as to avoid the complex becoming too complex. And the way in which I did it is the way many models follow it. It was not my idea. Of course, I tried to focus on the plywood sector, and to the extent of possible, I tried to keep the model as simple as possible and with the rest of the variables. That is why the rest of the sectors were modeled as is usually done in most models, that is to say, under perfect competition circumstances. The question that I was asked about what would happen if other market structures had been introduced for the other sectors, I don't have an answer to that because I didn't do it. And yes, perhaps the analysis would have been richer, but we're always debating on whether we should have a very complicated model or we try to keep it as simple as possible by trying to balance, and in this case focus on the plywood sector, which is the one that we care about. So yes, I agree, that would have been interesting, especially in those closely related sectors, if we had modeled them with a different market structure to see what would have happened. Now, finally, nobody asked this question, but here it goes. I would like to clarify certain things. The general equilibrium models are not ones that have reduced equations. They are structural equations. By the mere definition of what they are, those models are quite flexible, even perhaps more flexible than input-product model. And evidence of that is the fact that we can handle different elasticities, unlike an input-product model that would have an elasticity of 0. Technical coefficients assume that input are perfect complements, and therefore elasticity is reduced to 0. The elasticities that we use are ones that try to make the model more flexible to better reflect the features of the things that are being analyzed specifically. So the input-product analysis has its benefits, as well as the general equilibrium models have their own. But it's not that we just want to reduce equations like a Keynesian model. This is general equilibrium model that in a very explicit way is presenting an optimizing behavior of consumers and producers. This is something that is worth mentioning. There are elasticities that are endogenous also. For instance, what is the elasticity of plywood production vis-a-vis a tariff? Once I get the estimation, the result of that elasticity can be easily calculated just in an input product matrix. So what I want to clarify is that this is not a reduced simplistic, this is a general equilibrium model. I feel that we're back in the 1960s, and let me tell you why. To answer the question of the moderator, if I was asked today, in the input product literature, what is the most frequently addressed subject, would be, to me, information collection or recovery techniques for creating matrices. This includes RAS as one of those cases. Random and Murray wrote a paper that has 12 different optimization models, and in which you include an objective function to find the equal values, and whether it's linear or non-linear is what changes, whether you can make it linear. And RAS is an optimization model that minimizes distances between the original matrix and the matrix that's being estimated restricted to Borges limits. This has been studied ad nauseam, he's saying. And there are many information recovery techniques. It now includes the cross-entropy model. It's another one. It is the same thing, but just from a different perspective. So what I did was to create the 2003 Fernando matrix, and then we repriced it in 2008, and then we found that there were inconsistencies there, and we started creating more values in the grids to balance in the block-by-block approach, because when you work with a global adjustment of a matrix, you certainly get many errors in many sectors because it's a biproportional adjustment and it affects everything. So you need to come block by block. That's what we did, and that's how I adjusted the matrix to the 2008 without a problem. Now, there are some amazing things around this. There was a Halen and Jensen study that proves that at the end of the day, regardless of the method that you are using, the restrictions or the identities you're trying to achieve will dominate the solution. In other words, if you are in a polyhedron, as long as you have an internal solution, you start running it, and sooner or later you reach a model that from a holistic perspective will behave very well, even if the coefficients are not so accurate, but it's something that could be later explained. And to complement the question that was asked by Victor, speaking about sector 0, in literature you call that the flip-flop on the bang-bang models. The optimization models for linear programming do overcome the zero elasticity problem, the non-substitution theorem of Samuelson, have alternative vectors, and this is what I showed here, but they have a very serious problem. It's a pest, as Dr. Tiana said, and is the extreme specialization. As the linear programming solution includes that for each iteration there is a simultaneous equation solving polyhedral structure to follow that, many other things are left aside. If you have alternatives for production, you leave them aside, or at least a great number of them, because the matrix has to be square. That's the way it should be. That is the simplex technique. It doesn't matter where you do it from the dual perspective, it's the same. So the result is an extreme specialization. That is to say, I could recommend something that we actually did in our seminar. We include an input product seminar into the general equilibrium model, because it's actually what it is. The demand functions are on the side of the maximum, and the factors are endogenized according to the restrictions. And who did that? In Samuelson, Dorman and Kurman 1 year before that, and Ligar and Torpal. Whoever wants to read that, you can find the information. It's fascinating. But all of the extreme specialization models point to the same thing. You will discard certain sectors of technology just because they don't fit in the simplex solution. This is not a problem that has to do with reality. It's a problem due to the algorithms of simplex. So all of those models that were presented by the doctor have this intrinsic flaw or fault. And Tenrason is right, they become a plague because they shrink extreme solutions. The trick that is used is to include more resources or include differences between imports, whether they're substitutes or not. You extend it in such a way that you make certain that the solution has the right number of variables that are also the restrictions that are included as a restriction. That is what you use as a base. That's a very severe problem to consider now. But this has to be solved in a balanced way, and the answer will be interesting. Anyway, that's the end of my... I gave you a problem, not a solution, but what are we going to do? Why don't we begin on this side? All the questions were excellent. What I'd like to say is that the model doesn't consider square matrices, and perhaps this is where we're not understanding one another. I didn't mention this in my presentation, but if each sector has different technological alternatives to produce a determined good, then the matrix doesn't need to be square. And as a matter of fact, cannot listen to the gentleman. No, I don't agree, because in a solution you can have a sector that has more one technology already operating. So the matrix is rectangular. It's square. It's not square. He's saying something about the number of restrictions. The simplex model will give you 3 options. Can't hear the rest of the answer. That is a separate conversation. And perhaps we have a problem with terminology. Let's not go into that. I'll answer the questions first. In terms of information sources, the input product matrix by INEGI is the ones that I use. The size of the matrix was 90 sectors, even though the results were reduced to 15. The problem specialization that is also connected to this was not so abundant in my experiments, because this is a calibration and trial and error process until you're able to replicate the function that makes the most sense. And I can say that no, I didn't have that. I didn't have a sector producing everything or a region producing nothing, because the mere fact of restricting production by production factors takes care of that already. Elasticities, and yes, if you have a single vector in a matrix in elasticity 0, what's the problem with that? I don't see how that could be controversial. But if you can play with different technologies, in the beginning of a solution you can see how much land and water was required to get a product, and at the end of the solution, if the balance change, the irrigation or time variables change, I have a new combination of water and land, and this is what I meant. That is connected to your example. You can take one elasticity at the beginning of solution and re-estimate it. And it's not that there's an endogenous elasticity, but rather they could be estimated if you wanted them. But a single vector, a single column, it's not controversial. The input function as complements to one another. If you had different technologies, the usage of the factors that at the end of the day is what you are depicting in the nested functions of the general equilibrium models with those parameters, that's already included. But in this case, the treatment is different. About capital and labor restrictions, migration, if that's the question you have in mind, if you wanted to use this model for Europe and represent a full mobility solution, then you eliminate that restriction and you allow the population to freely move from one place to another according to whatever the model determines. The same thing with capital. And the way in which this was implemented in Mexico, that was not the question I was trying to answer. The purpose of the model was a different one. So that is why I don't have labor migration, but I'm not denying it. It's not saying that it doesn't happen, but it was not relevant for my investigation. And capital. Capital is one of the big things about modeling. At the end of the day, the capital that appears in those matrices that restrict production is an asset that is not easily moved. It is not financial capital in the sense that it is free to move freely. Those are industries' assets, the value of factories and machineries, and this is something that can be assumed in the short run, at least in a certain moment of time that won't change. Can the model work to do environmental impact assessment? Yes. A way in which this could be done in the case of mining and water. If the model is very clear and the water amounts are available for economic activities are clearly stated in the model, and you have a clear idea of the impact of water quality of having a mining operation, then you can reduce the quality of what's available for the model or the availability of water as a whole. If the model has less water in the region, then something else would be used as a configuration, and you can calibrate one or other solutions and see both impacts. This is something that can be done with forestry coverage or agricultural land. The model is flexible from that perspective. And about the results, I was asked by Lilia. The scenarios that I ran were water-restricted scenarios for each one of the regions according to environmental sustainability. For instance, if underground water was being used above the rates of aquifer recharge, it has to be limited, and therefore the model has less water available for activities in the region. The same thing with shallow water. So it is a simulation of a policy of concessions on the one hand of Conagua that is limited the use of water in certain areas, not everywhere. It would make sense. For instance, in the southern part, there's more water that's what is used by the population, but not in the north part. There's scarcity. So in the different model solutions, it is possible to reduce or at least to obtain the same level of a product by using less water, but then you need to substitute agricultural and irrigation for seasonal agricultural practices. If you need less water to get food, then more frequency of the seasonal agricultural practice would be necessary than the other types. And in the more dramatic scenarios in the model, this could be at 30% more expensive. And in the less conservative, they would increase by 5 to 8%. So yes, there's a negative impact in the prices of food products. But anyway, you can see the references in my presentation. You can consult the studies directly. Thank you. We thank our three speakers and please let's thank them for their effort. On behalf of the Metropolitan Autonomous University and INEGI, we thank you for your presentations, and we present you with a small diploma as an acknowledgement. I know the subjects could be discussed in length, but anyway, thank you for what you were able to share with the rest. Thank you.